Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Teachers Aligned podcast. I'm your host, Todd Scholl. This is episode number 32, and I hope that you are all doing well in every sense of the word well as we continue to make our way through this pandemic together. And I hope that you're finding the resources, including this podcast, that Teachers Aligned is putting out and that Self-Care for SE Educators is putting out. I hope that you guys are finding some great assistance in those resources. If you haven't had a chance to listen to last week's podcast, I highly recommend it with Dr. Rick Hansen. I want to thank him again for being on the show, but I am just as excited to bring on my guest today. She is a national board certified teacher. She's a South Asian American edupreneur with deep expertise in the fields of social and emotional learning and mindfulness in education. She's the founding executive director of Transformative Educational Leadership, an empowering, racially and culturally diverse, compassion-centered, innovative program for educational leaders who are called to integrate mindfulness-based social, emotional, academic, and ethical learning into schools and school systems. Prior to this, she spent 5.5 years working in partnership with the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL, to implement SEL system-wide in the Oakland Unified School District. She's taught and led in a variety of school settings, public, private, urban, international. She holds a Clear Administrative Services Credential in the state of California. She's the creator of the SEL Everyday online courses, author of Teach, Breathe, Learn, Mindfulness In and Out of the Classroom, and SEL Everyday, Integrating SEL with Instruction in Secondary Classrooms, which was chosen as one of 2019's favorite books for educators by the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley. Her article, Social and Emotional Learning Starts with Adults, was one of ASCD's 10 Best Express Articles of 2018. I could go on and on. Her bio is extensive. She has met with so many amazing people and trained with so many people, but we're not here to listen to me. We're here to listen to her. Please welcome to the program, Meena Srinivasan. And I know I'm getting that name wrong. Are they closer that time?
Pretty close. That was pretty close. It's Srinivasan.
Srinivasan. Sorry about that. Yeah. I know a guy named Srivastava. I know a guy named Vikas Srivastava. So I want to put the accent on the wrong part of the last name.
Believe it or not, my name, Meena Srinivasan, I'm not the only one. There are many of us. And in Southern India, it's like the equivalent of Kate Smith in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Meena, for agreeing to be on the show today. And I do want to give a shout out to Tisha Smalls-Brown, who connected us, and she was a part of that TEL training that you did, and she spoke so highly of it and highly of you. And she's one of my favorite people in this state doing this work and trying to promote this work. So I want to give her a little shout out. But I did want to ask you, because it's the elephant in the room, how are you doing as we go through this weird time, this pandemic together?
Yeah, well, thank you, Todd. I just wanted to pause for a moment and express my gratitude to you and to everyone that's tuning in, because there are so many other places and so many other things you could be doing right now, yet you've chosen to nourish yourself with this podcast and to listen to this conversation. And I hope we make your time worth it. And the truth is, in relation to the pandemic, but really in life, wherever we direct our attention, that's what nourishes us, right? So I think that's becoming even more apparent during this time of uncertainty. One of my teachers, Larry Ward, talks about how mindfulness, and we'll get into that a little more, I'm sure, in our conversation today, but how mindfulness can really support our capacity for enhancing our nervous system. So we're able to better hold greater complexity and greater uncertainty. And I think that's really how we need to be thinking about the practice now, as this loving awareness, as this ultimate embrace, and really cultivating this sense of inner expansiveness. And for me, in my life, I feel that, my practice in particular is around cultivating this inner expansiveness so I can hold both the pain but also the possibility of this moment. And I think hope is really, really important. And I'm not talking about hoping that our situation is different. I'm talking about active hope, which is something that Joanna Macy, who some of you may have heard of, has written a lot about. And active hope is really the sense of being clear of the vision that you want to create and then playing your role in making that vision a reality. So I see this as an opportunity, as the great reset or the great turning that Joanna Macy talks about. And a fellow South Asian sister of mine, Valerie Kaur, says, what if this darkness isn't the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? And so if we can reframe and really think about active hope as an anchor for our practice, for our way of being, kind of like our breath is an anchor in our mindfulness practice. I think that's really important, particularly as educators and educational leaders and parents. If we feel like, if we get caught in despair, right, in the spectrum of possibilities around how we meet this present moment and how we meet the future, on one end is hope and on the other end is despair. And I think that having a hopeful energy in the sense of active hope is key, because we need to transmit that energy to young people. My teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, talks a lot about the importance of our presence, and the unwritten curriculum in the classroom is our presence. And so that's really what we're transmitting. So I'll just pause there. I will say, well, one more thing. I have a 2-year-old. So it's been really interesting juggling work and caring for a toddler. And I'm grateful I have my husband, so we're sharing, childcare. But I think it's important for us to really center self-compassion at this time, because this is hard. This is a hard moment. So yes, we need to be hopeful. We need to practice active hope, but we also need to honor what's arising. And I think the practice of self-compassion, of just acknowledging this is a hard moment and doing what we need to do to care for ourselves so we can care for others, is really foundational.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to frame it for most of us. I mean, I think there's some folks who are facing very dire consequences, but there's also, for some of us, this opportunity to like you said, hit kind of a reset button to sort of really think deeply about educational structures and what we're doing and the purpose of schools, and the role of standardized testing and all kinds of things that we can potentially reframe and rebirth some new system that places value, that's more humanity based, and places more value on social emotional learning, for example. And I really also love the metaphor of mindfulness as creating space, and that we're not trying to push away the fears and the natural human responses, but making space for it, so we're not so zoomed in on it and it doesn't seem so large, and that we can maintain some equanimity and still have those experiences, but not allow them to become the primary focus of our awareness. Let's do this, because I think I didn't read your entire bio. There's a lot there, and I'd like you to tell your story. So if you would walk us through Meena's story, so that folks get an idea of how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Well, one thing I wanted to just mention about the expansiveness, because I think you were listening beautifully and really lifted that piece up. A visual that's really helpful for me is just the spacious blue sky, and the sense of, can we cultivate this spaciousness within? Because we have to be able to hold the suffering, but also hold those moments of joy that are also possible. And you also mentioned, there are lots of people who are in really, really dire circumstances right now. And I think another thing the virus is lifting up is the deep inequity in our country. If we look at who is being hit more with the virus, what communities are. And so I think this is an opportunity for us to press this reset and do some deep work, particularly around racial healing that needs to happen. In terms of my story, I I was a classroom teacher for more than a decade. I taught middle and high school. But social emotional learning and mindfulness were always foundational to teaching and learning. And I grew up very much exposed to a lot of these contemplative practices, being of Indian origin. My parents worked a lot growing up, and my neighbors, who are also Indian American, but were from South Africa, introduced me to yoga and meditation at a fairly young age. But oddly enough, when I graduated from college, I moved to Brazil and I taught at an international school there. And when I was there, people would always come up to me and say, "Você Indiana, teach me yoga, teach me meditation." But it wasn't a super deep part of my life at that point. And I was like, I grew up in New Jersey playing soccer, you know?
Right.
And but I really delved deeper into my practice. And at the same time, it was my first year of teaching, and I was reading Parker Palmer's book, The Courage to Teach. And it was just such a beautiful opportunity to really explore what it meant to approach teaching as one's spiritual practice. And for me, really from the start of my career as an educator, there's been this deep sense of it being a calling, and this understanding of just this tremendous opportunity we have to build a better world through education. You know, for me, this work has always been in service of creating a more compassionate and equitable world, and that sense has been with me for a long time, even growing up, in terms of being an activist in a lot of ways. So when I returned back from Brazil, I actually had a job lined up at the ABC network in New York. I thought it was my dream job to be like a foreign news producer, and I'd be going to work every day and doing lesson planning in my head. And so I kind of knew that my life was supposed to go in another direction. And I ended up actually moving to India to do deeper study of contemplative practices. And that was where I connected with Thich Nhat Hanh, who many of you may have heard of. And that really just kind of shifted my whole world when he was in India. The two areas he was focused on were mindfulness and education. And this is kind of before the movement really took off or exploded. We're talking, 12, 15 years ago. And I was just so grateful to be part of this, the beginnings of this work, and in a different cultural context as well. And so the other piece that he was focused on was Dalit Buddhism. And for those of you that know a little bit about India and the caste system, he was really focused on supporting those who've been deemed as untouchable in the community. And you can learn more about some work my husband and I have done with the Dalit community in India if you check out my website. But after about 5 years, my mom got sick. She actually had a double lung transplant. Oh my gosh, now 7 years ago. So talk about recognizing the importance of the breath. And so I moved back to the States, continued to teach, but one of my mentors who actually founded CASEL and also founded Transformative Educational Leadership with me, Linda Lantieri, had told me, I think it's time for you to transition out of the classroom. And I was teaching in Oakland at the time. And Oakland was one of 8 school districts that had partnered with CASEL to be part of something called the Collaborating Districts Initiative. And this initiative was really founded on a research question. And that research question was, okay, we know we can implement SEL at the school level, but can it be done in a large, complex, urban system? And so I had this amazing opportunity to be a part of this innovative team that was working with CASEL to really figure out, how do you do this in a large, complex urban school system? And some of the other districts that were part of this initiative were or are Nashville, Austin, Chicago, Anchorage, and it was just a tremendous learning experience for me. And a lot of the resources and tools that came out of this initiative are incredibly useful. The District Resource Center, the CASEL School Guide, a lot of those were created through this initiative. But one of the things that I realized through this work was that leadership is really key. And it wasn't an area of focus in this particular initiative beyond just the superintendent. And this is really where the work of TEL kind of took off, because I knew in order to be able to implement SEL, you have to model these skills and competencies, right? We talk a lot about the importance of adult SEL, and it just became so apparent that the schools that were really implementing SEL more effectively had leadership that was in a lot of ways embodying these skills and competencies. So in 2018, I had the opportunity to start Transformative Educational Leadership, which is this program that integrates mindfulness, SEL, and social and emotional learning and service of systems change with my colleagues Linda Lantieri and Daniel Reckstoff. And Antisha was part of our inaugural cohort. And another really important piece of that was that we made a commitment that we weren't going to move forward if our first cohort wasn't at least 40% leaders of color. So there was this real understanding that our leadership had to represent our student population nationally. And I'm excited to say we just admitted our second cohort, and there's 60% leaders of color that have been admitted. So I'd say, Todd, for me, I feel like my work really centers on the intersection of mindfulness, SEL, and what I like to call belonging. And I think that this work actually has to be in service of belonging. And so often, we talk about mindfulness for self-care, and that's really important. It's the first step, right? And it ultimately has to be in service of creating a more just, a more equitable world. And for me, belonging is this sense where everyone feels seen and heard, and you can't talk about belonging if you don't talk about power, right? So that's kind of where the juice is for me now, the intersection of mindfulness, SEL, and belonging. And it's very much the work that we are trying to do in TEL, but really in service of that systems change.
Yeah. That it's such a powerful story, and I appreciate you sharing that. One of the questions that I had as you were talking, and I think you kind of alluded to this near the end of what you were saying, one of the things I think has been a concern about, contemplative practices and implementing them is does it just get a person to become self-absorbed and focused on their own development? And I love the idea that you are connecting this to social inequities and injustices, because I've kind of been formulating this idea that we're going about attacking or trying to undo those inequities. We've been trying the same type of approach for a long time, which is just sort of bash people over the head with their ignorance. But I think maybe that approach is just never going to work, and that maybe what has the chance to work is folks adopting these contemplative practices to provide them some insights into it may be opening up their own eyes to the inequities, so that then they modify their own behavior. Tell me if that is something that you feel is a potential way or an effective way to address inequities, and if that's something that you are actively trying to promote through this work with TEL.
Completely. I think for any change to be lasting, it has to really it has to have that inner change, right? So much of this is around our beliefs. And I would love to share my definition of mindfulness, because it very much is connected. Would that be okay, Todd?
Yeah,
I'm going to do a little screen share. Is that all right?
Yeah.
For folks that are able to join us via video, you can see some of these slides. And for folks who can't, it'll still make sense. So this is how I define mindfulness. And this is my son when he was 16 months. He is now actually 25 months. So I define it as paying attention to our inner and outer life as it unfolds, while being grounded in our body, breathing, and senses, so that the mind can settle and we can cultivate a curious, open-hearted presence and awareness of interdependence. interbeing. And some of you may have heard of this term interbeing before, but I want to talk about it a bit because it's, I think, a real shift in how we need to orient ourselves around what mindfulness is, particularly in the West. And this happens, right, when we take contemplative practices out of their cultural context.
Yeah.
So here we go. Where's my slide advancer here? Oh, that's the definition again. So when I mentioned I had lived in India. I'm going to tell a little story to explain what I mean about interbeing, and kind of the origins of this term and where it comes from. So when I was living in India, there was a period where there were intense, there were a lot of challenges between Hindus and Muslims, in particular, in New Delhi in 2008. And in the course of 1 month, there were 5 bomb blasts, and our school was under lockdown. So I've had this experience of living in a heightened kind of environment before, where you literally, can't go shopping because a bomb could go off. And it was under this kind of backdrop that I was really searching for more concrete guidance on how to support my students during this tumultuous time. And so on the anniversary of Gandhi's birth, there was a peace activist who was visiting and who was speaking at the site of his martyrdom on the anniversary of his birth. And that speaker was Thich Nhat Hanh. And here's Thich Nhat Hanh with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. And for those of you who don't know, Thich Nhat Hanh is really a Vietnamese kind of global spiritual leader, and just a phenomenal being who has given so many beautiful teachings to the world around how we can cultivate peace in oneself so we can bring about peace in the world. And that night he introduced this term interbeing, and that night changed my life forever. Like, how you have those defining moments? That was like a defining, life-changing moment for me. And interbeing essentially means to interdependently coexist. It honors the interdependence of every person to all other persons and aspects of our planet. And in a beautiful illustration of interbeing, Thich Nhat Hanh writes that if you were a poet, you would see clearly that there is a cloud floating in the sheet of paper. Without the cloud, there'd be no rain. Without the rain, there'd be no trees. And without the trees, there'd be no paper. The cloud is essential for the paper to exist. If the cloud's not there, the paper can't be there either. And he goes on to say that if you look deeply enough, you can see the logger who cut down the trees and the logger's ancestors as well, and that sheet of paper. So for me, mindfulness rests on interbeing. Mindfulness is around cultivating our this sense of interbeing, really an interbeing consciousness, where we shift from looking at paper as an extraction with a forgetfulness to really understanding the infinite causes and conditions that have come into play. It's a totally different way of living and going about our lives. And the nonviolence that Dr. King and Gandhi practiced was really it grounded in interbeing. And Dr. King wrote, in a real sense, all life is interrelated. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. This is the interrelated structure of reality. And so, in the SEL world, in the mindfulness world, we talk a lot about needing to connect, but the truth is we're already connected. Right? We just need to shift ourselves from a strongly individuated, separate identity to a connected collective identity. And when we do that, we're going to view our world, our nation, and the work we do in schools with fresh eyes. And this requires a real paradigm shift. So I'm going to just stop the screen share there, but I wanted to kind of give a little more background, because I think this interbeing has to be the foundation for how we practice mindfulness moving forward.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that I see, because I think that is a beautiful concept and something worthy to promote, but I think in America we cling so tightly to this idea of individual identity and pulling oneself up by one's bootstrap, and to have that sense of liberty and individual freedom. that I think some folks, when they hear that, are afraid that somehow they're going to have to sacrifice that to promote this quality of interbeing. And I just ask you, so how do you, in a country that values that independence so much, how do you help people understand the value of interdependence?
Yeah, well, I think this pandemic is really lifting up um, a new way that we have to be in the world, where we're really seeing how our actions impact others, and we have to be a lot more aware. And where has it gotten us? Where has it gotten us? This individualism, the rugged individualism. I think it's brought about a lot of suffering. And I think that there are simple ways, even in an educational context, we can move towards the we. In particular in Oakland, recognizing a lot of our students are coming from more collectivist cultures. We really held this lens when we were even looking through and adopting an evidence-based social and emotional learning program. So even simple things, shifting learning targets from I to we, what can that do to the sense in the classroom? I think that as our resources become more scarce, or as we have to start relying more on local economies, people are gonna realize that we got to shift the entire way that we are living. And it can be scary for some. I get that. But this isn't working. This isn't working the direction that we're going in now. It's not working.
Yeah. And I would say too that what you're asking people to do is to get to see things as they really are, without the obscuration of ego. Because I think that's what happens, is that we cling so tightly to these identifications and to the ego that we construct, that we completely lose sight of interdependence. And through these contemplative practices, you can, and when neuroscience supports this, that we can let go of that clinging ego-centric mind and become more allocentric, or have that capacity to see our connections, our deep connections to other. And that's kind of the awakening I was alluding to earlier, that I feel like that is kind of like the antidote to the sort of hate and ignorance and selfishness that we're seeing when we get on social media, as we look on the news. We see this becoming so pervasive, and this conflict that we have in America, that I feel like if people can do this dive inside themselves, that there's like a new reframing of reality that helps them let go of the ego, and a lot of that conflict might go away.
Totally. We were just watching one of the Ram Dass documentary a couple weeks ago, Becoming Nobody. So, I mean, in a lot of Eastern wisdom traditions, right? This concept of no self is foundational, or identifying self more relationally is what is apparent in a lot of collectivist cultures. I do think that the inner work in these contemplative practices help us touch that no self nature, right? Like when you're on a deep retreat, that is what ultimately can unfold. And I think until you have that inner shift, then you're going to be approaching a lot of even just the activist work from a really different perspective, which is why, the greatest change agents of our times all had deeply spiritual, they had inner lives that informed their outer action, right? So even for me, when I think about the work of a sacred activist, it's really coming from this deep place inside that understands that, hey, I'm not the one doing this work. There is no I here, right? And I think that this is the shift we're going to have for us to, I think a lot about my son. And a friend of mine was at a training a few months ago, and one of the questions that she was asked was, all right, if you live a better life than your parents, raise your hand. If you think the next generation is going to have a better life than you, raise your hand. very few people raise their hand for the second question, right?
Mm.
So this is a very unique time where we need to start working in partnership with young people to birth a new way of being and doing in the world. Otherwise, with what's happening with climate change, and just the deep inequities that exist, they're only going to get more pervasive.
Yeah. What's interesting too is that I think not only do people cling to these sort of individual identities, but they also cling very tightly to collective identities that can be destructive. And,
Totally.
and there's this subtle difference between this interbeing concept, seeing the connections to everybody else, and then having these collective identities, whether they're nationalities, religions, whatever, creeds, political parties. So
Can I talk?
untangling all that is
Yeah.
a challenge. Yeah.
Can I speak to that for a little bit? So, one of my spiritual mentors shared with me this framework, and it really speaks to how I think about like my identity journey. And it's claim it, clean it up, and let it go. So, particularly for those of us who are not of the dominant culture, claiming your identity is really important. One of my earliest childhood memories is of a girl telling me how ugly I am because I'm brown. And so there is the work of internalized oppression, that a lot of folks who are not of the dominant culture that they have to work through, a lot of inner work there. So this piece around claiming one's identity, being proud of one's identity, understanding your background is really important. And then the work of cleaning it up. Whether you are from the dominant culture or not, this sense of working through any type of internalized oppression or white guilt, or but doing that inner work of cleaning it up, and then ultimately letting it go, because we are so much more than that. Being a woman of color informs how I experience the world and how the world experiences me, no doubt, but I know I am so much more than that. And so this cleaning it up, letting it go has been a powerful way for me to really step into my own leadership around this particular work. You understand the importance that various identities play, but ultimately you're integrated in a sense. And there is this deep understanding of we're so much more than that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. One of the questions that I don't know where I read this article recently, but I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts about this. It's kind of related to what we're talking about. So we all know kind of what cultural appropriation is. I'll be honest, when I was a teenager, I hadn't even heard of the term cultural appropriation. I'm sure I was guilty of it at times. I mean, I really loved hip hop music, and I bought different types of clothing and stuff, and just was appropriating probably left and right, and was unconscious about what I was doing. Now I'm aware of it, but then it occurred to me, here I am teaching, I'm trying to teach concepts that were developed by Asian sages over thousands of years. And then is this another form of appropriation when a white guy who read a few books and who studied a little bit of Advaita Vedanta and Zen Buddhism now goes and tries to teach it? Is that another form of appropriation? And when we go to yoga studios and we see rainbow chakra T-shirts and bracelets and things like that, and the commodification of these spiritual teachings being sold by companies, what is the appropriate sort of way to look at that, and what are some concerns that you might have?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm so grateful you asked this question. We probably have to do a separate podcast just on this topic, because I am in a group of other, people of Indian origin. It's a closed group where we talk deeply about some of the challenges that we're experiencing. Well, a couple of things I want to say about cultural appropriation. So there's cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation, and the difference is subtle. And it has a lot to do with power and harm, right? And so often folks of the dominant culture are just completely unaware of the inherent power they have, and they take things that aren't theirs and utilize them, and charge money for them and commodify them. And in some cases, I've seen huge disrespect of Indian culture, things that are just so inappropriate, or like people putting, the Didi Ganesha, like people putting handbags on him, thinking
Right.
that it's like, decorative to hold the products that you're trying to sell, and not this Didi that has deep importance to so many people. So I think the question for folks, it's an inquiry, is just for people to reflect on power and harm, when, there's things from other cultures that I appreciate and that I love, but I try to just really ask myself, where's power and where's harm coming into play here? And another thing I just want to mention is just to give a comparison. So there's all these yoga teacher trainings out there, right? I mean, yeah, I got my RYT like 15 years ago myself, but as I've been doing deeper study and understanding power dynamics over the past, over a decade or so, if I studied Judaism or Christianity for 200 hours, would I be deemed a minister or a rabbi? I don't think so, right?
Right.
And, it's a complicated question. But I think that for folks who are of the dominant culture, even just naming, this is where I learned this from, I'm on this journey, this comes from this cultural tradition, is a first step. And I also want to say that it's not just white folks. Like, there are people of color who are not of, Indian origin in particular, who are not exempt from cultural appropriation, right? Nobody is exempt. The power dynamic might be a little different. But I think the larger issue here is when these practices have come to the West and they've become commercialized and commodified, and Indians have been part of that too. But there's this self-appointed guru phenomenon that exists in the West. And, I'm part of a lineage. I'm part of spiritual community. I have folks who keep me in check. And this idea of being part of a lineage where your transmitted teachings is, I think, really important. And it's something that Western culture, as things like yoga and mindfulness become more popular, that it's not something that's really been lifted up. And another thing I want to mention too, particularly when we talk about the modern mindfulness movement, right? Community or sangha has been totally absent from it, which is why I think it's great what you're doing with Teachers Aligned, because one thing Thich Nhat Hanh says is the next Buddha is the sangha. It's the community. And so I think we just have to be in an inquiry. I'm in an inquiry myself around, when should I say something? When do I not say something? When do I write someone a private message like, hey, that's not appropriate? And, who am I to be the authority just because I'm from this particular cultural origin, right? So it's complicated. Let's all just remember that we're all learning. And Maya Angelou has this great quote that's like, when you know better, do better. So let's all just be gentle and kind. When you know better, do better. But hey, if you think you might be appropriating, just do some reflection on power and harm here. There's a lot of resources out there.
That's a wonderful response. I appreciate that. And that's,
yeah. And we could go on and on, Todd. This is like, is like a whole other part of my life.
Yeah. I really just hadn't thought about it as a potential appropriation when I was going around doing presentations on mindfulness. And I realized I needed to be really careful about what I was claiming to be. Because I would sometimes, after I did that for a while, people would say, Todd is the guru of mindfulness. And I'm like, no, I'm not the guru of mindfulness. I practice it, but I'm not the guru of mindfulness at all. And I always try to, show where I get my resources and connect it to neuroscience and connect it to, and that's the other thing too, is there's this balancing, this play between, I have to, in a public school setting, connect it to Western science.
Mm-hmm.
And even though some of the core components of it come from the East, I have to, it's a weird dynamic in a public school setting, because it's almost kind of like you're saying, you're almost discrediting because you're afraid of setting off red flags that where a lot of the truths of this come from, because John Kabat-Zinn didn't invent it. You know what I'm saying? Like, he certainly helped bring it to the West, but the concepts come from from other places.
And Todd, the contemplative practices, when I think of the two components of contemplative practice, they're awareness and communion. And those exist in all spiritual cultural traditions. And one of the things I encourage a lot of dominant culture folks to do is like connect with your ancestors. I got my ancestors. Connect with your ancestors, because it's there. And there's a great resource, the Tree of Contemplative Practices from the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. Have you seen the tree with all the different, I'm going to show it because I have it right here, because it is a powerful resource. And I would really encourage folks, hold on one second, I'm going to just do a screen share for folks that are able to see video, and folks who aren't, check out the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. So you see here, look at all of these different practices. Sitting meditation, Vipassana is like one.
Right.
There are so many ways that we can cultivate. So these roots really point to the components, the essential components of all contemplative practices: communion and connection and awareness. And you see here, there are so many, from meditation to council or circle practice, right? Which has become very popular in a lot of our schools. So I encourage folks to check that out, find what works for you, and do what you can to connect with your ancestral cultural traditions.
Yeah. That's great advice, and thank you for sharing that. And if you would send that to me, I can put maybe a link to it, maybe.
Definitely.
Or yeah,
for sure. I'll send it to you right after.
So let's shift gears a little bit here. I want to give you an opportunity to talk about TEL, and to talk about, because most of the listeners here are going to be educators, and if they've listened this long, they must have a pretty deep interest in mindfulness and these subjects. And I feel like, based upon what Tisha told me about her experience going through the training, that is a really great opportunity for educators. So talk a little bit about that training, what a teacher could expect, and if they're interested, how they can maybe apply to be a part of the next.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the training is really trying to fill a gap, because there really is no, there are no opportunities out there to bring together mindfulness, social emotional learning, and equity, really equity centered, in service of systems change. And, there's no like professional development for leaders in particular that are trying to bring these fields together. So I think TEL is doing something very unique in that way. And then I think also our commitment, our guest faculty. I mean, we have a phenomenal guest faculty, from like Peter Senge to Elena Aguilar to John Powell and Zaretta Hammond, and, they're majority thought leaders of color. And our leadership team is as well. And our leadership team, we have 2 former superintendents, and then myself, Linda, and Daniel, who started the organization. And I think what's unique is you have this year-long experience. And of course, we're in the midst right now of pivoting and redesigning. So we're offering the most relevant programming that's deeply situated in our COVID-19 context, right? But you have this year-long journey where the model that we have, and again, it's going to probably be modified a little in the face of COVID, and folks who are going to be part of our next cohort are going to have the TEL experience through the lens of COVID-19. I think it's going to be powerful. But we have in-person retreats, 3 that are spaced out throughout the year. And then every month there are 2 calls with a guest faculty, and these are thought leaders like those who I've mentioned before. And then you have a small cohort, and the cohort really supports that reflection, integration, and application of what you're learning. I think what is really unique is the emphasis on the inner work. We really, our tagline's interpersonal development in service of systemic transformation. So is this real sense of kind of what you spoke to before, like that real powerful change has to come from within if it's going to be lasting.
Yeah.
So that is a really critical part of our work. In terms of kind of where we are right now, we've just admitted folks to our second cohort, but if any of you are listening and you're still really interested, check out our website. Because of the shifting nature with COVID-19, we might be able to, although we're almost at capacity, accept a few more leaders, so just contact us. And then for those of you who are not yet ready for that intensity, I have 2 online courses that are very much centered. They're centered on mindfulness and SEL and service of belonging. And there's a course for educators, it's self-paced, self-directed, and a course for leaders that is really, I kind of think about the educator one as everything I wish I knew when I was in the classroom. And the leader course is everything I wish I knew before I had my district SEL job. But really they're bringing together mindfulness and social and emotional learning. So bringing together these 2 fields in service of belonging. So those 3 aspects are fundamental, foundational, and are the driving force behind both of those courses, and also very much connected to the work we're doing in TEL.
And I want to share that website for those who are listening right now, transformativeeducationalleadership.com. Is that right? Transformative.
It's TEleadership.org.
TE Leadership. Okay. I'm looking at a website that says Transformative Educational Leadership. Is that, so it's been updated?
It's been updated. That might be when Tisha applied like 2 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's give the website again. I'm sorry.
We did a whole rebranding. So at TEleadership.org.
TEleadership.org. Okay.
Yeah.
So TEleadership.org.
Yeah.
And are you still, is it connected to the Omega Institute? Is there still a connection there?
You know, again, it's like so many things are in flux right now. We are set to do a conference at Omega on caring for each other and the planet before our next TEL cohort commences. But, you know, New York State is experiencing, is being hit hard by Corona. So we're still waiting on guidance from the CDC and how best to move forward. It's likely the first retreat may have to happen virtually, but again, we're still figuring it all out as we move forward.
What is your advice for a teacher who may be interested in learning more, but maybe they can't commit to something like this program or a longer retreat? I know just myself, like thinking about when I was, in my 30s, and I was really starting to be interested in mindfulness, but the thought of spending lots of money to go on a retreat and then to, leave my kids for 7 to 10 days or whatever was just didn't seem feasible. What are some recommendations you would give to an educator who is really interested in exploring and expanding mindfulness, developing their own practice, understanding the fundamentals of it? What would be your advice for a teacher approaching that who doesn't necessarily have the means or the time to do retreats or go off to?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of, virtual offerings, but nothing is like, unplugging and really being with yourself. On a very basic level, Todd, it's like, just, can you start with like 5 minutes a day? There's so many books out there, but I love the Insight Timer app. I actually have some meditations on there now. And so that is a great way to start. Just exploring some of these practices. There are some wonderful books out there, which I'm sure, members of your community have written and can share about. And, but I think folks have to find what resonates with them. And I would say start small, but be consistent. So if you want to really start engaging in these practices, I would recommend like 5-minute silent meditation a day. Start there. and then add on to that. There's so many different entry points that people have too. I mean, for some folks, it might be more of mindful movement. Right, the purpose of yoga, chitta vriddhi nirodha, is like to stop your mind from making these mental oscillations. And so the actual purpose of yoga was to prepare us for sitting practice ultimately. So I know, but in the West, it's become like, how to get a really great tushy and abs or something.
Right.
So I would just say, find what resonates with you, start small, be consistent. There's no end point. This is a journey of lifetimes, this path of awakening.
Sure. Would you be willing to, we've got just a little bit of time left, would you be willing to lead us in a short practice so they can get a taste of what that would be like?
Yeah, I would love that. And I'd love to offer something that really kind of speaks to our current context right now, of the pandemic. So folks can just get comfortable wherever you are. And if you can gently close your eyes, start bringing some awareness to your breathing. If it feels available to you, you can also place your hand on your heart. I'm going to offer a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, and then I'm going to lead us in a practice to help us resource ourselves during this time of uncertainty. So Thich Nhat Hanh writes, "When the crowded Vietnamese refugee boats met with storms or pirates, if everyone panicked, all would be lost. But if even one person on the boat remained calm and centered, it was enough. It showed the way for everyone to survive." So calm is contagious. And I invite us now to really ground our feet into the earth, extending those roots, the sense of rootedness. Just like a tree's roots can extend, and even as the weather changes or there are storms, that trunk and the roots remain steady and strong. So rooting down into the earth, cultivating this sense of groundedness, of centeredness. And if your mind wanders, gently bring it back, grounding your feet into the earth, feeling that stability and that solidity. And just as rootedness and groundedness is important now, so is open-heartedness and compassion. So I'm going to invite you to simultaneously, as you're rooting your feet into the earth, to see if you can expand your chest, if it's accessible, bringing your arms out, breathing in and out of your heart. As we offer both groundedness and compassion at this time. Knowing that those who have come before us have gone through far worse, and you can draw upon their strength and their presence to be with you. Think about your ancestors. And placing your hand on your heart, taking a few more conscious breaths in and out. And if your eyes are closed, you can gently open them. And I like to close with this other Thich Nhat Hanh quote that kind of speaks to that expansiveness and spaciousness we talked about before. And Thich Nhat Hanh says, if your cup is small, a little bit of salt will make the water salty. If your heart is small, then a little bit of pain can make you suffer. Your heart must be large. So I hope that this podcast has been helpful in some way to those of you who are tuning in, and may our hearts grow as wide as the world as we offer rootedness and compassion to others at this time. Thank you so much, Todd.
Thank you, Meena. It's been a wonderful conversation. We've touched on a lot of subjects, and I feel like we wound up where we needed to be the most, which is back home and back at center. And thank you for those reminders and the practice, and thank you for your time and your thoughts today.
You're welcome. Take care, folks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. All right, everybody. That was Meena Srinivasan. I think I got it right. And you can check out teleadership.org, and I'll put all the links into the show notes to the resources that she recommends, so that you can do your own investigation and exploration of those resources. I want to thank her again for her time, and thank you for listening to this episode of the Teachers Aligned podcast. You can connect with us at teachersaligned.org. You can also find us on Facebook at Teachers Aligned and on Instagram at Teachers Aligned Network. I hope you have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time on the Teachers Aligned podcast.